Welcome to tonight's Michigan State University Beekeeping Office Hours webinar. Today is August 3rd, 2026, and I'm here with Zachary Wong, Keith Mason, Megan Milbrath, and Dan Wines, and I'm Anna Heck. And this is a Michigan State University Extension program, and our programs and materials are open to all. So I'll start us off with some announcements. We will have a bloom update from Zachary Wong, a weather update from Keith Mason, some beekeeping updates from Dan and others, and then we will respond to your beekeeping questions. Our MSU Extension website for beekeeping is canr.msu.edu/bees, and that is one of the places where we post the webinar recording. So we are recording tonight's webinar, and it normally takes us about a week or so to post the recording in the video section of the website. You can also find our webinar recordings on our YouTube channel. So that's the Michigan State University Beekeeping YouTube channel. We have compiled resources for August in our August resources for Michigan beekeepers online article. So you can find that on the MSU Extension website. And we have different resources based off of the time of year it is. We also want to just highlight that there is a new edition of the Tools for Varroa Management Guide from the Honeybee Health Coalition. This is a really excellent guide if you are wanting to learn more about Varroa management and Varroa mites in general. It has different tables with the different treatment options, including the newer treatments that were recently approved. Michigan State University is hosting a Beepalooza event on August 30th from 1 to 4 p.m. at the MSU Horticulture Gardens on campus. So this is a family-friendly event where you'll learn about lots of different kinds of bees. So especially highlighting the wild species of bees that we have in Michigan. We are also excited to have the Michigan Beekeepers Association Spring Conference at the Kellogg Center on MSU campus again. It'll be on Saturday, February 27th, 2027, and the keynote presenter will be Kara Wagner. I also just want to highlight and thank people for continuing to give us feedback. So if you are listening live tonight, you should see the post-program evaluation survey when you close out of Zoom and in the follow-up email that comes from Zoom tomorrow. That feedback, we read it every month. It's really helpful for us to know what people are thinking and getting out of the webinars and for us to get your feedback. We will send another email with a different survey in October or November, and this will be to anyone who's joined any of our webinars this year, our office hour webinars. And this has a slightly different objective to measure if participants made changes based on the webinars. This is an important thing that MSU Extension likes to know. We want your honest feedback, but it is helpful for us to be able to ask those questions. So I just want to give people a heads up that month or two from now, you should get another email with another survey. And that feedback is really, really important to us, even if you've been giving us the feedback after each webinar. So thank you for those of you who take time to give us feedback and fill out the surveys. All right, we get different funding from different sources to support our work, especially from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We have also funding from Project GREEEN to support the weather updates we're receiving through these webinars, and then Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development supports our work. If you have questions outside of tonight's webinar, please use the Ask Extension form to send them our way. You can find that on our pollinators.msu.edu website, and then you click the questions button and you'll find the Ask Extension form where you can ask questions. And it's also really helpful if you include photos if you're trying to figure out what you're seeing in your hives. And then for tonight's webinar, you can use the Zoom Q&A box to ask your questions. All right, and with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Zach for his flower report.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Zachary Huang. I'm going to share with you what's blooming now. So, starting with the first one, the BB tree. There was a typo. Male flowers were humming with bees on July 24th. But today I looked again, there was thousands of bees. And now they're female flowers. So it's an interesting plant. It blooms usually males first for about a week or 10 days, and then I think the male flowers actually drop off, but I'm actually not sure if the structure stays on flowers female again. I need to pay attention next year to look at the actual transition. I used to think the flowers drop, even the branches drop and produce shoots again, but that's not true because today I see again that's only 10 days ago from July 24th. That was the peak male flowers. Today is Boswell's bees and the female flowers are blooming, more bees. So of course, with female flowers, there's no pollen, so it's just nectar. So it must be a very good honey plant. That's why it's called a vivi tree. It's in the family Rutaceae, so same family as oranges and lemon. And another tree, a big tree blooming, is Japanese pagoda tree. There's one at MSU. If you drive near the Yulin, near the end, it's blooming right now. It's a greenish flower. It's a legume, and in China they call it national locust. But of course, the Latin name has japonica in it because a lot of naturalists go to Japan, name it there, but it's actually in other places of Asia. So I think the bee tree guy in Michigan, he sells those, the Japanese pagoda tree. It's a good plant because it blooms right now, which is not a lot of other competitions, not the major large-scale trees or other than clover, white clover and sweet clover, which still blooming, and of course milkweed. But those are like milkweed. It's great, but it's just not abundant enough. And also Purple Drive, I think, is also still blooming. But the two flowers it was last July 3rd was the time I updated. Was just beginning to bloom. The boneset and Joe Pyeweed was two very similar. In it's about 5 or 6 feet tall, and the flowers it's sort of hard to distinguish. They're both asters. Uh, Another plant I saw in the Beer Botanic Garden was in the Jimson family, Araliaceae, American spikenard. So it's interesting plant. A lot of yellow jackets foraging on it. I waited for a while. I didn't see a honeybee, but it means it has a lot of nectar. If the yellow jackets are starting to forage a lot because caterpillars are probably going downhill. So pretty soon, actually saw a few trying to get into my small experimental colonies, yellow jackets. So they're starting to get into bees because they run out of resources. Corvus root, which is now moved to Plantagenaceae. It's sort of similar to gooseneck, the inflorescence, not of bees. I saw loaded with bees also a week ago. It's still blooming right now. All kinds of thistles, uh, boar thistles, global thistles, and then there's also 3 or 4 species of seraphim. One's called campus plant, another one's called cup plant. They're all in the same genus. Rosenweed, and they're all blooming right now. Very tall asters, 5, 6, 7 feet tall, even big, big showy yellow flowers, and honeybees will forage on it. Of course, all kinds of different sunflowers. Early goldenrod has been blooming also, Solidago Johnsia. And another interesting plant I saw in the botanic garden is Spanish oyster plant. It's a yellow aster, a lot of bees and wasps. It's an interesting plant because the leaves are so prickly, so you probably don't want to plant it in your garden unless you're doing a deer fence or something. because they will get into you. But lots of flowers. It's just the leaves are kind of uh, will hurt you if you're not careful. All kinds of mints, mountain mint has been blooming. That's very attractive to honeybees. Other mints are horse mint, curly mint, apple mint. All those are blooming. Probably spearmint too. All kinds of different in family Lamiaceae. Sesame, Malawas, sesame plants are blooming. I've seen bees foraging on them. For now, slight robin right now when I work on my small colonies, but not too bad. But still some nectar flow. I don't know exactly what plants. I'm on the other ones I talked about. Probably big SMVB tree, but they're not super abundant in Michigan. So, and Japanese pagoda tree is not a native tree, and neither of those are native. But they're not invasive, so I would say, if they're not invasive, even though they're exotic, if they're good for the bees, you can plant them. Uh, I actually missed one or two. I should actually just Google my own website. I just did a Google and I saw I missed the wind sumac because it's not planted in the Bio Botanic Garden, but I think it's in the Japanese garden, so I would have seen it if I went there. White carrots should be blooming soon. There's one corduroy flowering spurge, which is actually Euphorbiaceae, quite attractive to honeybees also. Uh, what's this one? Okay, that's still white carrots, also called Vietnam's lace, another name. So coming up, there's one tree near Music Building at MSU campus, Chinese sumac. It usually blooms in September, really late. But this year, I don't know, it's producing shoots now, so it might be blooming 2 weeks early. Rus chinensis, again, it's introduced, but it's not invasive. And bees will be loving it with nectar and pollen when it blooms. So if you are passing through the campus, drive near the music building, late August or September, and see bees buzzing. Very few other plants blooming at that time, other than, of course, goldenrod. That's probably a month away. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Zach. All right, and now we're going to, oh, here's the BB tree video.
Oh, okay, I forgot. So this is a male tree, and look at how many bees buzzing. And my video quality. I probably pan too fast. Should be able to see a lot of flight. I should do horizontal one for PowerPoint so it shows better probably. But today I see double the amount. But how do you see the bees?
The it the video maybe was it looked good on my end, so it might just be how I'm showing. I'll play it one more time here.
I think it's moved too fast. And YouTube probably compressed it.
I can see lots and lots of bees on the flowers, so that's pretty
Yeah,
cool. And we'll share
yeah,
the link too so people can just see the video on YouTube.
yeah. Just one single tree. If you ask me how much honey it would use, I would say probably at least a super of honey from that single tree. Just so many bees. Today is probably, I would say, 8,000 bees easy on that tree.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Zach. Keith, you're up next with our weather report.
All right. So yeah, happy August, everybody. I can't believe it's already August here now. So I'm Keith Mason. I'm the coordinator of the EnviroWeather program. on campus, a weather network and associated models and things to help growers out. And we're also working with this group to put together some models for beekeepers as well. So we're going to try to integrate where crop plants are blooming and then where other nectar resource plants would bloom, kind of in in a calendar for beekeepers to use. So, looking at some weather, we usually start off with a just kind of the last week, just because we all have a good memory of the last week, maybe. But yeah, really comfortable. I think most folks would agree. We were in the 70s for most of the time last week. Uh, it was actually a little bit warmer than normal as well in this area or for the past week. You can see on the right hand side here these kind of light tans are 2 to 4 degrees above normal. And then our the darker ones, like up in the western UP here, are 6 to 8 degrees, or excuse me, 4 to 6 degrees warmer than average. So visible, we could see that we're doing well, and there's some well, we'll see how our growing degree days have shaped up a little bit since then, but or over the last month. But if we look through the last month, we'd see pretty much the same picture where our temperatures were really mild, 60s and 70s actually, because you're going back a little further into some cool periods. Um, but when we look at the overall, the monthly average temperature, it's pretty close to normal for most of Michigan, at least the lower peninsula. There are some warm spots in the western UP and in the eastern UP as well that are kind of catching up a little bit with growing degree days. So those areas were at least 2 degrees warmer than normal, for that month period. And we kind of measure our heat units or accumulated heat over time with growing degree days. And using the methods that we've got here, they're running at about 1100, maybe 1150 in the Upper Peninsula, to over 2000 growing degree days in the southeast corner of Michigan. So this basically is a way that we can measure how far we are in the season relative to other seasons, and that's what we're showing on the right here. And it's the days. It's calculated to be the number of days that we're either ahead or behind of schedule. And these red colors here show that most of Michigan is ahead of normal as far as our growing degree days go. There's some kind of normal areas in the upper central portion of the state, but in general, it is a little bit ahead of where we are normally in kind of our growth, or at least where we should be with our growth based on growing degree days. And kind of if you look at how far we are ahead, it's generally about 7 days ahead of where we were, say, well, in an average year. That's a little bit higher up here in the western UP, where it's closer to 2 weeks that we're ahead up there. Excuse me. And I also wanted to show this way of looking at temperatures, because we talk about normals a lot, and that's a 30-year average is what meteorologists and climatologists use to say what's average or what's normal. And that's shown by this tannish brown band here in the center. So it's the high and the low. So that's the range of temperatures that we normally would find. The blue lines here are the high temperatures at the top. So this is a daily high temperature, and then the low temperatures at the bottom. And you can see where we are relative to what's normal on this graph by the positions of these the bars. And so, we had some very warm periods in January where we were much above normal, but again, we remember the very cold periods we had um, in February. Uh, really, so almost some records, I think, in some areas. But the idea is that this is one way to track how the year is going as far as normals or what we consider as an average. And I'll just say that the pink area here, the line that's at the top, that's the extreme high temperature. So that's the record high temperature for that date. And that's not on the 30-year average. That is, let's see. Oh, maybe that is, 96 to 26. So I guess they have a different 30-year average that they're using for that. Um, I actually thought that the highs were, the more like a 130-year record. So I'll have to check that out. But yeah, so high temperatures are shown here in the red line, and then there's a blue line at the bottom for the extreme low temperatures, so the record lows. Um, but yeah, that's just kind of a way to look at how we really are setting up in compared to normal. And that's mostly temperature. We have another one for rainfall that I'll show after this here. But looking back, we had pretty dry weather. Most areas did receive about a quarter of an inch, but in general, things were mostly below normal. When we can see all these tan and oranges here on the right-hand side, which is the comparison to normal. So anywhere for a half to a full inch below normal in most areas in Michigan for last week. Um, and it was really a continuation of the story we've been seeing in July, actually, that that was a fairly dry month overall. There was a couple of, I think there were a couple of different storm paths that we picked up during the year, but those were very isolated, or during the month, and they were very isolated. But it's depends on where you were. If you got a half an inch or did you get 6 inches, and all in a short period of time. So, but most areas did receive at least an inch, but that's not really keeping up with the amount that's evaporating from the soil because of the heat. Um, so we're yeah we're three to so again, yeah, some of these areas had 3 inches of rain. That was more than normal, and they then there are other areas, most of the state actually was more like 2 inches below normal. So there were some spots that really got rain, but most of it not. And we're starting to see some last or some effects here in the central part of Michigan because soils are drying out. And I wanted to show our this drought monitor, and I'm going to zoom in a little on Michigan. I'm going to try anyway. Yeah. So if what this map does is it highlights areas that are in drought. And we can see here in Michigan, it's been pretty much white for the last couple of months because we kind of caught up on the rainfall that we were working on a surplus actually from early in the year. But here you can see that they're now starting to show up on the drought monitor, that we've got these abnormally dry areas and even some drought up in the UP. But yeah, this it's a scale that goes from yellow through oranges into very dark, where some of these real problem areas are here that they've had for actually quite a while. But yeah, so we are starting to see this show up on the drought monitor. Okay, here's the other view of normals for rainfall. It's not as because it's really accumulated rainfall that we're looking at here. So in this graph, the green line is the rainfall that we've accumulated this year. And as you trace along this line, you can see some parts where it's almost vertical. So those are periods of really high rainfall. and that was where we got a lot of our surplus early in the year. I mean, we had a very wet spring, and but we were mixed in with some dry periods as well, like we're kind of having now. Um, but the normal accumulation line is the brown line that goes through here. So we've technically been above the normal, so we haven't had any drought effects. But as we're getting here into July, we've had flat accumulation of rainfall, right? So no rainfall is accumulating, and basically we're now below where we are normally. So we're hoping there is a little bit of we had rain just this last week, so that'll be reflected in probably I think that the middle of the month is when the new drought monitor comes out. But so we're hoping to see some rainfall, and here's the look at our weather map. And it does look like coming in Tuesday into Wednesday that we might see rain starting in the north. There's a cold front over here. The green area is an area of of rain. They we're under high pressure right now, blue skies, clear, dry. That's adding to our soil dryness. But as we move ahead a couple of days, actually, yeah, further on to Wednesday, that's when we're going to start to see that rain come through. So it I haven't actually looked at what the estimated amounts are here. So we're hoping that it does, add on to the benefits we just got from this rain that came through this past weekend. So when we do look at what the forecasts in how much rain we're going to get for the week ahead, it is a mix again. The Northwest looks like it's going to do fairly well. Maybe an inch and a half of rain, but everywhere else looks like, half an inch to an inch might be what we're doing. So still less rain than we'd really like to have, especially in central and southeast Michigan, where things are probably going to be less than half an inch for this particular week, the way it looks from here. Kind of our looking out 8 to 14 days. I mentioned or I've been mentioned before about the jet stream and how the pattern of that, if there's a big ridge or trough that's over our area, that really affects our weather. And it does too when it's flat like this. So this is pretty much west to east flow, zonal flow that we'd call. But it does bring in chances for weather, for storms. So looks like, for the 8 to 14 day range, we will probably be warmer than normal here on the right-hand side, but there's a pretty good signal that will be above normal for that period. So kind of a week of, not so much, and then hopefully we're going to catch up a bit towards the middle of the month. How long that's going to last, I think it's kind of limited, because when we look at the month of August as a whole, it's a little bit warmer in the southern portions, and then we can't really tell, for the rest of the state. But it's also, hard to say what's going on here. It could be wetter, it could be drier. It's just equal chances. If it was gray, that'd be normal. So that's much better. But white is like there's just not a strong signal here. But again, it certainly doesn't show that we're going to have a lot of rainfall for the entire month. So that probably means that the second half isn't going to be as wet as the first half, I think. But I'm just an entomologist, remember, people. Okay. And then the seasonal outlook again is it doesn't really show us a lot of signal. It looks like the southeast corner of the state is going to be warmer than normal. And this is for the August through October season. So a 3-month look at this, which has a lot going on, so it doesn't surprise me that we don't see a lot of strong signals one way or another. But again, for precipitation, it looks to be drier than normal up north, um, and without any direction for the rest of the state here. So, so that's a, I guess it just doesn't give me much warmth seeing that because I can't really tell what's going on. So. Um, we talked a little bit about El Nino, and I just wanted to briefly show these maps because they're more colorful than what I showed last week, and it shows the difference in what happens when we have an El Nino, which we're in now, and it is strengthening. But for the Midwest, when we look at temperatures, so that's whether the temperature is going to be higher or lower than normal. It's kind of like what we've been looking with the other maps. Um, there's not a lot of change here. And actually the white here in this one is in the normal range. So we don't see much effect here in the Midwest as far as temperature goes. The Southwest or the western portion of the state does look like it's going to be a little bit cooler than they normally are during the fall. Um, for rainfall, precipitation, again, we're a little drier than normal in some areas, and then normal in others. So it's not super strong of an effect, but we're seeing a little bit here in the Midwest. Nothing like what they see in the Pacific Northwest here with and they've already got plenty of drought issues going on there. So that's not the best news for them to have an El Nino in the fall. Um, but then when we look at the winter, which is what this is, much more colorful, um, we can see that there's a really strong signal for it being warmer than it normally is during the winter time. So that's the milder winter, and the drier winter is also fairly strong for El Ninos. I probably should have said that this is of all the El Ninos that were recorded, this were the trends that were going on during those periods. They looked at, okay, were we higher than normal during an El Nino in the fall or in the winter? And same thing for the precipitation. So it's a historical view. This doesn't tell us what we're going to have. It just tells us what we're likely to have and what we normally expect. Um, so yeah, just real brief summary, a little bit above normal last week, and kind of normal, close to normal for the month of July. Some areas are, a little bit warmer up in the Western UP. And that just kind of resulted in us staying at about 7 days ahead of development than we normally would estimate. Rainfall is an issue. We're not seeing a lot. There were some areas that got too much, but those were very isolated. And yeah, we're drying out. We're seeing Michigan show up on the drought monitor. So yeah, we're hoping for a little bit more, some relief from this 8 to 14 day outlook that shows we'll have above normal rainfall and yeah, a little warmer temperatures, but that's okay too. It is August. And then yeah, the jet stream hopefully is going to bring that stuff, those systems over, so that we'll have more precipitation throughout the month. And then seasonal toss-ups, yeah, who knows? So yeah, that's basically all I've got. Yeah, these are just some of the sources that I've used here. So yeah, I don't know if there are any questions from
There,
here.
there's one
Yeah.
so there's some that are kind of related to weather, but I think are more bee and plant questions. But there is one that is just weather based, and it says, why do they use the 30-year history for the normal history?
Right. So it's a convention that a bunch of meteorologists and climatologists came up with. It's from the World Meteorological Organization, and there's an American Association of State Climatologists. And so they're, all climate scientists, and they agreed we have to have something to compare to if we're going to say things are warmer than normal, or so we can actually identify the trends. So it was decided that they were going to do it every 10 years and use 30 years of data for that average. So it's really a way to standardize it. And it was agreed upon by, yeah, a bunch of stuffy shirt people. No, sorry. A bunch of, yeah, meteorologists, pocket protector, that kind of person.
That's excellent. I love how you actually had the answer at the ready for that.
You bet. Yeah, I see this stuff all the time. So yeah, I'll hang out for a little bit and see if because yeah, the dry soils are, going to affect nectar flow, looks like. So, or at least, I'm a pessimist, so I would always say that, but or say the worst thing. But yeah, here I'll stop sharing and let you guys go on. But I'll hang on for a little bit here and just listen to some questions.
Thanks, Keith. Um, there is a question. I'm not. I'll put it. So I think it's directed to you, Keith, but I think it might be more of a Zachary question. So it's asking about studies that look at whether heavy continuous rainfall have a negative effect on pollen and nectar on plants being washed away, leaving little for pollinators, including bees. Do plants do anything during heavy constant rain to protect the sources? So I'm thinking specifically always when I hear something like this about black locust. But Zachary, do you know anything about plants and heavy rain?
So most plants, I think, cannot have much to do. They they have limited growth behavior. Although some smaller, if it's trees, there's not much they can do. But if it's smaller plants, sometimes they would droop their flowers and change direction of the flowers, so trying to protect their resources a little bit. If they normally like bloom flowers are normally like this, but in rain maybe they are facing down, so that's some protection. But not in a major storm in Michigan. When it's really blowing. Yeah. So yeah, if the rain is really bad, you got 4 inches in half a day. That's not much flowers can do. Plants. I've seen peony flowers just all wiped out just after like last big storm in Michigan. And peonies were all gone basically. Even the petals are gone. Uh, so yeah, that's definitely not good for pollinators if it's too much rain in a very short downpour. Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if there are some plants that are in rainy environments that have or maybe that's why there's a long corolla, right? A long tube corolla so that everything's down inside. Or could be another benefit, but
Yeah.
that's a cool question.
I don't know. Like in the tropical rainforest, whether the flowers are different if there's not a rain, the structure different or not. Trying to
There's
adapt
a graduate
to,
student
yeah.
project, there's a master's project.
Uh, uh,
And then on the topic of things that affect flowers, I'm jokingly going to assign this one to Anna of how the wildfire fire smoke is affecting our bees and flowers.
I want to know what Zach has to say.
I well, I
I, I,
Oh, go ahead. Before Zach goes, I will say that I know there is research ongoing from um, Washington State University on this that has experienced a lot of wildflowers, and I did reach out to them to ask them when they were going to publish it because we've been getting the reason it was a joke is because we've been getting so many questions about the effects of wildfire smoke. And I really don't know of any data, and we haven't done any research here at MSU, but I know that there's stuff happening out west that isn't published. But I also want to know what Zachary knows.
I got into it by two different TV stations last 2 weeks. So
I've been sending them to you.
there's some literature about air pollution, how that affects
Mhm.
honeybees learning and memory and their immune system is all negative, and their orientation, homing ability. So wildfire would of course affect air quality because we had upwards near almost 400, 350 air quality indexes. Like right now, normally it should be anywhere between 30 to 70. But when the Canadian wildfire was bad about 2 weeks ago, it was about 350. And I had a student doing swimming, and these did not swim normally during those days. I don't know if the student was just new or was the air quality affecting their swimming behavior. So yeah, it will affect the homing. They can't see the UV pattern on the sky. It's so the sky. I think one day here you can see the sunlight with your naked eye. It's so smoggy. Sun is like a red ball. Usually you cannot look in the sun directly because it can hurt your eyes. But on that day I could do that at 10 o'clock in the morning. It's a red ball like a moon. So in a day like that, all the UV pattern and sky is going to be probably blocked. Yeah. I
Mm.
think, yeah, UV light is a short wave. It's more easily scattered, whereas infrared, well, it's a longer wave, so it can get around bigger particles easier. Uh, so that's an easy way. If it's too short a wave, it gets scattered easy. So then the bees have trouble getting home when it's very bad.
And then there's also questions on the wild if the wildfire fire smoke will affect the taste of the honey. I think where we were in Michigan, it was so brief, but there's one good way to find out.
Yeah, I know if there some people smoke the honey so bad, and some people try to harvest the honey, just smoking the bees. I could taste the smoke, but I don't know how. It's just after, just like a day after the harvest, you can smell it, but I don't know how long that smoke taste would stay in the honey, if they go away or not. They might stay for a while. It's not that volatile. If it's just smoke particles in the honey, you probably stay for a long time. It's not a volatile odor that's going to be gone, evaporated. Smoke particles will be, I think they stay in the honey. So maybe in Canada, somebody could do an experiment, see if you can taste it. But in Michigan, it was only 2 or 3 days, so
Hmm.
probably not.
Dan, do you want to do an update of the colony management you've been doing recently or plan to do soon?
Yeah. So I guess just recapping the last month, July was primarily just harvesting. We had, and speaking in the kind of Ingham County is where the majority of MSU bees are. So relative to that location, so really poor spring, but kind of was more than made up for starting right at the end of June when it got hot and through mid-July. So a lot of harvesting supers, what I've been seeing recently the last, I say 10 days to 2 weeks. Zachary mentioned there's still a little bit of nectar coming in here and there, but they've certainly slowed down off that peak flow. Little bit of robbing, it's not terrible yet, but we're into the time of year and we don't leave, doors open in the building and things like that because bees do start turning up. There's still food out there for them, but it's more scarce than it was a couple weeks ago, and that's typical this time of year. I mean, it often slows down before that. So it's turned out to be, I'd say, certainly as far as honey yield ahead of last year, and but it's a pretty intense flow in the early part of July there. Most colonies I've stripped down to just one super remaining. We don't generally do a lot of goldenrod honey in around Lansing, Okemos area. So not really leaving them stacked up too high for that. What does dribble in can fill out that last box. I typically look to harvest. I kind of like to be done with honey by uh, Labor Day. So kind of penciling in that pulling last supers off everything that last week in August and getting it extracted, getting everything down to winter configurations. I did get a treatment on most everything in the last 10 days. Since it's cooled down, we've had these, 70s and low 80s. Formic acid, Formic Pro is a primary treatment I use through the summer months. And so with that, we didn't have a break in the heat or a schedule availability for me sort of for a few weeks there, end of June into mid-July. So, was pleased when we got some of those 70, mid 70s temperatures. That's a really good temperature. I find that works really well for formic. So most colonies got treated, in the last 10 days. And then I'll just say, I mentioned having them kind of stripped down to winter configuration by the end of August, early September. I will kind of assess where I'm at there with mite management and probably be looking at another treatment at some point in September, depending on where we're at, and then also start the feeding in that. And I generally like to do the bulk of my feeding in September with maybe a little topping off in October, depending on the fall temperatures and how long the bees are staying active. But I like to have most of them within sight of winter weight by the end of September. So that's kind of what's ahead for me. But of course, it'll be try to be proactive, but there is a lot of reacting to what the bees are doing and what the weather is doing and the plants are doing and all of that. So, but that's how things are penciled out at this stage.
Great, thank you. All right, Megan, what other questions do we have?
So there's still some more plant questions first, and then the beekeeping ones are starting to come in. So there's a question for Zachary about goldenrods, especially which ones are better pollen nectar sources than others. This person said they heard that early sources are not as beneficial as the later blooming sources. And this person is coming from like upstate New York, Vermont area. Do you know anything? Do you want to go deep into the Solidagos?
Yeah, Solidago, there's like 21 or 22 species in Michigan alone, native or native plants. But the two most common ones in Michigan and New York State, I think, are the same as the two in Michigan. So the most common one that's very relevant for bees is the Canada goldenrod, Solidago canadensis. And there's another one, it's tall goldenrod, Artemisia, I think.
Altissima.
Artissima. So it's Solidago Artissima. So those two, I would say, if you recognize those two, the big patches of fields of gold would be one of those. Either probably more likely Canada, but also could be tall. I used to see a lot of them as gauze. They say the ones with gauze are more likely from the tall, so that's tall goldenrod rather than the Canadian ones. Tall ones, of course, are a little bit taller than Canada. There's differences on the underside of the leaves, whether it's hairy or not. Has small, tiny differences. The flowers are almost the same. I think one is longer, or one slightly longer, so that you will need to have a ruler to measure to distinguish the two species. But otherwise, they look very similar. Both form big patches. Both are excellent for both nectar and pollen for honeybees. It's basically our last main crop for bees going through the winter. So, and if it's good weather, you should get a super fall of honey from the goldenrod. Yeah, but, but it's some days they come too early and left too early. Sometimes they come too late, and the frost comes and they don't do too well right after frost. So it's not very reliable. You cannot depend it, saying you can depend that crop for your winter bees. So you have to keep an eye, basically decide whether to feed or not by looking at the goldenrod and checking your hives, how much is coming. So just know those two species is good enough for beekeepers. Yeah.
Mhm. And I will say where I am in Jackson County, I usually see the peak of those two species, the Canadensis and the Altissima, right around like September 7th. And really, really consistently the first week of September. So even though we are seeing goldenrod, but one of them is called legitimately, its name is early goldenrod. And so there, as Zachary mentioned, there's like 22 or 23 species, but the two big ones will be early September down in this part of the state, and obviously other times.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
you will see early ones here and there by the highway, but they are not huge patches like those other two species.
mhm.
When they bloom, you can see acres and acres of it. It's so beautiful. Yeah. Right after September. Yeah.
Mhm. And with the combo with the asters at the same time, it's so pretty.
Uh,
Um, okay, Dan, there's a beekeeper that has a hive that has four heavy supers that are not capped. Your advice, what should they do for next steps?
Um, so you could leave them for a couple weeks, a month. It's still, we've still got summer left. We've still got warm weather and, bees' ability to dry it out. Um, you could check it with a refractometer, even though it's not capped. I know a lot of beekeepers report, uncapped honey still pests at 17, which is totally fine to extract. It's not going to ferment, so you could, take, samples from a few spots around the frame. One of the things you can do, you can also, if you take a open frame and shake it, if it's really high moisture, it's just going to come out. Like that's very obvious. But if it's marginal, checking with the refractometer. Um, but being first week of August, there's kind of no rush. You can certainly leave it for the bees to continue working on for a while. If you're itching to get it off, you can, and it is still a little bit high. You can, if you have like a small room, you can set it up with good airflow of just a box fan or something and a dehumidifier. And if you're moving good air through, because um, when honey or nectar is still in the comb, it's got a very large surface area. So moving dry air across it, you will be able to drop the moisture a percent or two in a matter of a couple days. It is much easier to dry honey out prior to extracting it because you have all that surface area of it in the cells. Once it's extracted and you've got it in a bucket or whatever vessel, you're only going to be able to dry it from the top. Like it doesn't, the drying doesn't penetrate through. You'd have to be constantly mixing it. And if you do dry honey like in a bucket, you'll notice when you go to stir it, it kind of forms a drier skin on top. So a couple options, but given it's the first week of August, it's great. You've got, four supers full. I would say, give them a few more weeks is the easiest thing, and go from there.
All right, and then so there are some questions about feeding bees. So Anna, if it's drier and warmer, do we need to feed hives for longer?
So I like the connection with paying attention to the weather, but really for me, it is looking at what is in the hive and what is coming in. So if your bees are still bringing in nectar, especially if you have honey supers on, we shouldn't be feeding them because we are collecting honey for humans. If you're at a point where you are taking off supers, you can think about feeding them. You can also pay attention to what bees are bringing in and looking in the hive. But I base that more off of the colony signs because it really does depend on what's in bloom and what bees are bringing back to the hives.
And like where I am is tons of wetlands right now, so they are bringing in the purple loosestrife. They are very happy right now in this moment, bringing in some antifreeze colored nectar. Um, all right. Um, let's see. We've only got a couple questions coming in so far. So, Zachary, there's a question about the BB trees. There was also a comment that was nice to remind us that BB trees can be considered of concern in some areas. So maybe picking one or the other, not having multiple of them so you don't get a lot of seeds. Um, but the question is, does the male BB tree only give pollen and the female BB tree get, well, I guess that's the way it's written. Does the male BB tree only give pollen?
I think they produce both pollen and the nectar, and because the female flowers only has nectar by definition.
Mhm.
When the male flowers were blooming, I observed their behavior to see if bees are licking, and they were. So that means they have nectar and pollen.
Mhm. All right. Um, there's a question. Um, So whether or not we feel that fall feeding, actually, I'm going to see if Zachary, if you want to give input on this one first again. Do you think that fall feeding will impact the development of winter bees? If so, how?
Yes, only if you're feeding pollen. So, for example, if you're feeding pollen, say October, September, October, got all these mad Heather Matilla actually did a study feeding pollen in observation hive to see if that would help the bees winter better. But actually, I think they marked cohorts and they actually worked backwards. So if the problem is if you feed them pollen, the brood variant's going to be kept on longer, and the brood variant is actually detrimental. It delays the production of winter bees. So if I feed pollen substitute or pollen, let's say November 1st in Michigan, and that's going to lengthen the brood variant. So in October, they're going to slowly, probably mid-November to mid-December, they're going to slowly dwindle into small, then finally probably stop sometime in near December. But if you give them pollen, they're going to raise a larger patch of brood. So the bees emerged earlier in October have to take care of those bees. So any bees that started nursing, they would die in the winter. So only the bees that came out not exposed to a lot of brood famine, not really participated in the brood rearing, those bees will be long-lived. So you could actually help bees live shorter by feeding them pollen in the fall. So that was a mixed message that God had a paper, if I remember correctly. Yeah. So
No,
actually, yeah.
I think you did
Yeah.
remember pretty correctly. I put the link to Allison McCaff wrote a lovely ABJ article about that study, Heather Matala's study, and I put that in the chat. Yeah, that that's a good memory for 6 years ago when that came
Uh,
out. So there's a question that I'll take the first crack at. It says I cull frames and comb every spring, and the frames are still in good shape but getting old. Should they be disinfected or replaced? Can they be disinfected? So there are many methods of disinfection. We've been working on some disinfection methods in my lab. We also got a grant to do further disinfection methods. One of the things that is of main concern is what you're trying to disinfect them of. If it is American foulbrood, then obviously that's it's really basically a very, very difficult slash impossible to disinfect them from the American foulbrood spores. If it's European foulbrood, you can put effort into disinfecting them. But one thing to keep in mind is that the bees themselves, for both EFB and nosema, the bees themselves will have a lot of the pathogen in the adult bees. So you can make the combs perfectly pristine and you're going to put dirty bees back in on them. And when I was a postdoc working with Zachary, we actually took all of our frames and brought them all the way down to a gamma irradiation facility and got them completely sterilized. And it was a matter of weeks before the bees started showing signs of nosema disease again in there. So you can absolutely put in efforts for disinfection. We do recommend that you pull out frames when they get like older than 5 years old, or the ones that especially have lots of pollen or have dead brood in them. Because not only for pathogens, but also for pesticide buildup. But there isn't like a hard and fast rule of what you should do because you're going to be balancing your time, money, and effort with the, probability that things are still going to be coming in anyway. Does anyone want to add to that? I do use, I guess for my frames, I do use heat to disinfect. So I use a kind of like a dry heat melter to melt down all of my frames. So they do get, the frames themselves get pretty sterilized. All right. Here's a good question. I think we should go around the room for, we'll start with Anna and then go to Dan. What does your winter setup look like? Is it two deeps and a super? Any advice for insulation wraps, moisture boards, quilt boxes, etc.?
Yeah, so most of our bees are for my personal operation are in two deeps or single deeps, and that we use 10 frame equipment. We pull honey and then we'll feed syrup. We need to feed the single colonies more syrup, but we do that to give them food stores. And then I am enthusiastic about mouse guards because I do not like when mice get into the hive. So there's lots of different ways you can do it. We just use hardware mesh and staple it over the entrances, and our boxes have auger holes underneath the handles. So make sure that that's covered with hardware cloth. And because otherwise mice can get in the winter, they like to build a nest, they'll eat the pollen and make a mess of the frames. They often coexist with a live honeybee colony in there, but it's icky. So, and that's about what we do. I used to work for the University of Minnesota Bee Lab a long time ago. They have a wintering system where they use moisture boards on top of the inner covers and they use black wraps, either the corrugated plastic or tar paper. That system worked really well. And then we started just not doing that because we had heard that other beekeepers were having really good success as long as bees were going into winter healthy with lots of honey. And so now we just do the low maintenance way of just worrying about mouse guards. And so that's for Dan and I in our personal operation. And I'll let Dan also say what he does for MSU.
Yeah, so campus bees, we have a mix of 8 frame and 10 frame equipment. Um, Most overwinters, regardless of 8 or 10, as a double deep, but have been overwintering more singles the last couple of years with decent results, like results I'm happy with. Um, there's more feed generally goes into those singles. Just as they're in honey production mode, there's not having only I typically run 9 frames in a 10 frame box and 9 frames, with a full late summer brood nest does not allow a lot of room for honey storage there. So there is a lot of feeding that goes into them to get them up to winter weight. So as that brood nest contracts down going into winter, they can fill that in with syrup. There's some nectar coming in too. I said earlier, generally have super stripped off before goldenrod. Not that we get a lot, but what we do get, I'm just happy if it goes in as winter feed for the bees. It's less syrup. Um, and same as Anna said with, mouse guards, half-inch hardware cloth at the entrances, and if there's any auger holes or things like that, or if you've got a box with a soft corner or something like that, like trying to seal any of those cracks to keep rodents out. Do not do anything in particular for quilt boxes, top insulation, tar paper wraps, nothing like that. Um, yeah, not some end up with top entrances and some don't, just as a function of some of the inner covers have notches in them and some don't. I often find you give them an upper entrance and the bees propolize it up anyways. Um, so that's kind of what we do. The one thing I do pay attention to as I'm going around kind of in that, setting them up for winter mode, starting to feed and things like that, is make sure that their entrances are all pointed, they're all level or slightly downhill. So usually I throw a shovel in the truck, and I do that in the spring as well. But things settle, things move over time, and so just making sure that if you've got a landing board sticking out the front, it's not gonna act as a catch for rain and snow melt, where then you're gonna have this cold, wet, um, bottom board that's collecting all that debris. And instead of on warm days, bees cleaning out some of that debris that's dry and easy to carry, you just end up with this cold, moldy soup of hive detritus. So, mouse guards and pointing the entrance slightly downhill are really the main things. Once I've, taken care of, they've got enough weight on feed wise, and we've done our job with mite management through the summer.
And mine's the same. I don't do I have tried quilt boxes and the foam boards and the um board, what are those boards called that Minnesota uses? I've tried all of those and I've gone to do and I've done, wrapped with tar paper. I will say the one difference is that I have overwintered quite a few in three deeps. And especially when I was living up in the UP in the winter and I didn't have time to bounce back and forth and feed the bees. So when it was a longer period when I thought that I couldn't get to feed them, overwintering in three deeps made it really easy um, because it allowed me to just confirm that there was enough food on them and I didn't have to worry about it. So I will say the person did request like two deeps and a super as an option. And the really big downside to that is when the bees move up in that super, then your bees are in that super for the whole next year. And then that super gets incorporated into becoming brood nests for the next year. So at MSU in my own operation, I'm trying to be better about really differentiating, deeps are for bees, mediums are for human consumption. So the for the honey for human consumption. And so we really try to differentiate those two. And so if you leave that super on there, that super kind of becomes part of the what the bees get. Um, all right. Anna, I inadvertently polluted the honey supers in my hives with frames that contain sugar syrup. Can I leave these honey supers on my hives for winter feed instead of feeding during the fall?
All right. So, yeah, so up to you. So what Megan was just saying about differentiating between boxes that we in frames that we use for the bees versus boxes that we use for honey supers is a really good thing to think about. And if you're going to then have supers that have syrup in them that we're not going to extract for humans, or you could just mark them and just know that those are now for the bees and brood boxes, and you can use them in for winter, leaving them on as feed for the bees.
Dan, if using bee escapes, how many days before do you place them on before extraction?
Um, Typically 1 to up to 3 days before I go retrieve that honey. It may end up in the hot room so it may not get extracted immediately, But one good day, I will say it's if it's not good flying weather, like if it's kind of a rainy day, the bee activity is diminished. I like a little longer. I find they don't clear as well in when days when bees are less active. Um, I also take a blower along with me. There's often a few bees left, even, and I don't think that's a case of leaving it on longer and you would get to zero bees. It's just sometimes there's a couple dozen bees left, and I've got a little battery workshop blower to clear out the few stragglers with. But one day usually does it. Two is great. I don't like to leave them beyond three because even though we don't have huge problems with hive beetles, it's I feel like the clocks, once you start removing bees from that super, they have less ability to patrol that and kind of keep beetles from making a mess of things. So I feel like the beetle clock starts ticking as soon as you put that escape board in. So that's why I don't like to leave them for days on end.
The
And I
beetles.
will say also with using an escape board, pay very close attention that anything above that escape is bee tight. So if your boxes have a broken corner or an auger hole, or your inner cover has a notch in it, or there's some wax propolis buildup so it doesn't sit down, if there's a gap that a bee can get through, they will, and you'll come back to find an empty box with a bunch of wax capping flakes on the escape board. So make sure you want bees to go out, make sure they can't get back in from the exterior.
So then the next question, it says, is the beginning or middle of September an okay time to treat bees with Apiguard? So I'm going to put the most recent label for Apiguard in the chat. So that is a thymol-based treatment that has to be used after honey supers are off. Um, the main consideration with that one is it does have a temperature consideration that it's supposed to be between 105 degrees, below 105 degrees Fahrenheit and above 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And what I've found for me, and I think you can use it, okay, it's intervals of 1 to 2 weeks, up to 4 applications. So it's designed to be in there for a really long time, but it's a product that has to be used by the bees, like coming into contact with it and moving it around. And what I've personally found is if I use it too far into September, the bees just don't have time to move it around because they start going into cluster too much because it gets too cold. So it has been because I do like the thymol options, um, it's been one of the things if I can get all my honey off that I'm going to use for humans kind of before the goldenrod hits so that the bees get the goldenrod, and then that also allows me to use thymol a little bit earlier, so like beginning of September. But there have been many years that I've put it on and then it just sits on the card because it got too cold too fast. I don't know. I think I'm the one who uses the Apiguard the most on this. That's why I answered it. But Anna or Dan, did you have any additions?
Nope, don't have a real depth of experience with it.
Yeah, I do use it often after I take honey supers off, but it is kind of this in Michigan we kind of have this window of like after honey before it gets too cold and you have to be like ready to catch it. Um I am happy this person was anonymous. This is somebody posted here, which is literally my worst nightmare. And every time I open a bucket, I just picture this scenario and I'm horrified that this exists. Um, a friend extracted their honey and didn't seal the bucket. A mouse got into the bucket. I don't know the details, this person said. Is there anything useful you can do with the spoiled honey? Can you give it back somehow? Um, Anna, I'm giving you all the real tough ones. Do you want to start with this one?
So I'm just thinking about how we have extension educators who work on food safety, and they do this series called Mich Michigan Honey and Maple Syrup. I'll look it up. Honey and Maple Syrup Safely. So it's a food
Yeah.
safety program, and they've been doing monthly webinars, which is really nice, and they talk through a lot about the food safety considerations of processing honey, even if you are doing it under the Michigan's honey and maple syrup exemption and don't need to be licensed. So you could definitely ask them this question. I think the main thing would be to make sure that it's not getting anywhere near human consumption. But, maybe after you have extracted your honey for the season, if you are trying to feed your bees syrup for them to store in the brood nest in combs that are only going to be used for the bees, you could maybe put some honey into that syrup too if you wanted to feed your own honey back to your bees. We normally don't recommend feeding bees honey because, at least from an unlearned source, because it can have American foul brood spores. But in this case, the source of that honey. That's about all I can think of.
I haven't had the mouse situation, but I have had some really spectacular spills in my honey house where stuff has ended up on the floor. And obviously, I'm not going to sell that to humans. But what I have done is put it in a bucket and then it crystallizes in the bucket. And then I fed it back to bees in the wintertime. And then one time I did that, one time I put it in the bucket to feed the bees in the wintertime, and the raccoons and my dog got into it, and it got eaten before that could happen. But I think that would be the one safe option. Um, all right. For mouse guards, do you use 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch hardware cloth for mouse guards? Dan, what do we use at MSU?
1/2 inch works to keep mice out in my experience. I have used 1/4 inch. That absolutely works too. The one caveat there is if you use 1/4 inch, I pull that off early in the spring because I've found it strips pollen. Bees get through it, but in wriggling through it, it kind of acts as a pollen trap gate, and it'll strip those first pollens of the spring, the maples and willows coming in. So usually end of February, I take them out if I've used quarter. But I've gone to half. I was skeptical that it would keep a mouse out, but it does. So.
Yeah, the only times I've had problems with the 1/2 inch is when like a raccoon pulls the corner off or something. Um, so should a queen excluder be removed after harvest? Or Anna, do you want to talk about keeping queen excluders on at wintertime?
Yeah, so we remove them when we pull the honey supers, and so we don't need the queen excluder at all in the winter because the colony is clustering, and you want the bees to be able to cluster with the queen in there. So we just remove the queen excluder when we take off the supers.
Okay, and then the last question, Dan, I'll have you start, or actually, Zachary, do you want to, so you talked about the pollen, the effects of pollen for winter bees. Do you want to talk at all about syrup for winter bees?
Yes, so the answer is no, it does not affect, does not impact winter bees whatsoever. If typically in Michigan here, if when you're feeding liquid sugar to bees, that should be done probably latest to be ideally before October 1st, I would say. But if you're really low and the weather is warmish, maybe you can push it to October 10th. They still have 20 days. Bees stop flying around November 1st in Michigan, general rule of thumb. So they have about 20 days. Remember, they have to make those syrup into honey like consistency so they do not crystallize. Uh, so occasionally you see dead hives, you see a lot of uncapped white crystal in the cells. That's because the sugar was fed too late and they were crystallizing and not made into the honey consistency. To make it into honey consistency, they have to be about 18% moisture, ideally capped, and then that would be treated as honey in the colony. But if you feed them too late, like December, there's not much they can do. They don't have time to dry them. So it's not gonna impact production of winter bees per se, but it's gonna affect the survival of the whole colony. So don't feed them too late. And feed only 2 to 1 if you do it in the fall. So 2 parts of sugar, 1 part of water. And for that, you usually have to heat it up a little bit to get the sucrose into solution. because it's above the saturation. So that's my answer.
Excellent. So I did put the link to an article that our selling pure Michigan honey and syrup safely. I know they will continue to have the webinars throughout this year because I know they emailed Anna and I to ask the ones that we'd be available for, and I haven't responded back. So I know they're setting up their calendar for the winter. With a quick search, I didn't see them online, but maybe we can, or
Uh,
Anna can speak to
they're
it.
yeah, so they're listed on our. I put the next one in the chat, so that is on August 17th. But they also list them on the Beekeeping and Pollinator event page. And if you're signed up for our digest, then you can also get the notifications that way as well.
And they're really useful. I've sat in for a few of them in terms of like how to sanitize your beekeeping equip or your honey processing equipment, like how to deal with your jars, how to deal with your buckets. They're really, really useful for that. Not only because you can listen to the information, but they also have a lot of Q&A time too. Um, all right, this is the question we're gonna end on, and it's for Keith, since you stuck through the whole time. Keith, Weatherman Keith. Um, the Bee Club summer picnic is this Thursday, August 6th, but you talked about rain on Wednesday. Will their picnic have sunshine on Thursday? And no more information on the location, but just predict it.
Oh my goodness. I think there will be some sun and some clouds.
Perfect.
Maybe some rain, maybe not. No, I think it's hard to tell, that 7 days out. Because yeah, really we only get good rain prediction at 3 days. So we're right at the edge there for whether it's going to happen on Thursday. But the way the system is that's moving through Wednesday or Tuesday through Wednesday probably will be done by Thursday. So I would cross my fingers and say it's going to be a good day.
So we have
Excellent.
rain. We have rain coming on Wednesday.
Wednesday.
On Wednesdays, yeah.
Yep.
So the day after tomorrow. Okay.
Yep.
Uh,
I have it blocked
okay.
off for an office day. All
Okay.
right. Thanks, everyone, for all your fantastic questions. And we look forward to talking to you all next month with our September office hours, which are going to be a week later to account for the holiday. So I think they're September 14th, if I'm correct. So thanks, everyone, and best to you and your bees.
Have a good night. Thanks, everyone.
Later.